Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Welcome to the third session of this Jornadas Especiais de Retórica. This activity, organized by the current board of the Brazilian Rhetoric Society, presided by Professor Tiziano Curvelo, aims to bring together important figures and institutions involved in the development and consolidation of rhetorical studies in Brazil. We held a first panel with former president of SBR itself, founded in 2010. A second panel with former presidents of the Portuguese and Spanish rhetoric societies, as well as the Ibero-American Rhetoric Organization. And now a third panel with some former presidents of the International Society for the History of Rhetoric and its current president. It is both a joy and an honor to chair this panel and to welcome Professors Larry Green, Manfred Kraus, Hanne Roer, and Reames. Professor Larry Green is Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California. He served as president of the ISHR from 2004 to 2005. And at the Los Angeles conference, he organized 3 panel discussions on rhetorical studies featuring scholars from countries that had previously been unrepresented within the International Society for the History of Rhetoric, including Brazil. This initiative was one of the factors that encouraged the creation of the Brazilian Society. He was also the first president to participate as a keynote speaker at an SBR conference 14 years ago in Belo Horizonte. Professor Manfred Kraus is Professor Emeritus at the University of Tübingen and served as president of the Society for 2015 to 16. He has visited Brazil several times and was also president of the International Society for the History of Jesuit Rhetoric. He has contributed not only through publications in Brazil, but also through his support for Brazilian researchers. Professor Hanne Roer from the University of Copenhagen served as president of the International Society for the History of Rhetoric from 2024 to 25 and organized the Society's most recent conference. She is also a representative of the International Society for the Jesuit History of Rhetoric, serving as vice president. She co-edited the volume on the Catholic Reformation and Anden Reformation in 2017, including an article of Father Antonio Vieira, helping to disseminate the Portuguese language voice of the Counter-Reformation in Denmark. She has also visited Brazil twice. All 3 are honorary members of the Brazilian Society for Rhetoric. Finally, we welcome the current president of the International Society for History of Rhetoric, Professor Robin Reames, from Indiana University, Bloomington, who is organizing the first conference to be held in Latin America, in Mexico, in 2027. By the way, the deadline for submitting proposal is June 30th. 3 questions have been proposed for each participant, who will have approximately 15 minutes to speak. This will be followed by a period for comments from the audience. The questions are, first, why and when did you begin studying rhetoric, and what has been or is your area of research within the field? Second, what was your experience as president of the International Society for the History of Rhetoric like? And in Robin's case, what are the challenges and expectations involved in organizing the first conference in Latin America as the Society celebrates its 50th anniversary? Third, I would like you to tell us about impressions of the rhetorical studies in Brazil and how do you see the possibilities for collaboration between the International Society and societies such as SBR or other Latin America associations. Well, the session will last approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. I do not intend to be draconian about timekeeping, but I hope we can remain reasonable, close to the schedule. Before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to thank Marcos Divino and Benedito Carlos for their technical support. Thank you all for being here, and I give the floor to Professor Larry Green. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you so very much, and my thanks to the Society and everyone who put this together. It's very difficult to do so. I appreciate what you've gone through here. I am very sorry not to be with you in person today, but a colloquium by computer screen has advantages. In particular, you can go get a cup of coffee without anyone noticing you are gone. My introduction to rhetoric was an undergraduate seminar with the very young Thomas Conley, who had just started to teach at Berkeley, California. I had no idea what rhetoric was, much less classical rhetoric. And neither did the other two students. We met in Tom's office, where he would read his detailed lecture notes to us, reading from a yellow pad, page by page, starting with prefix. We were just beginning Aristotle when the Berkeley campus erupted in demonstrations against the American war in Vietnam. And the police helicopters tear gassed the entire campus, including Tom's office and the four of us. Tom moved us off campus to the safety of the local student beer hall. And he was absolutely not going to read his lectures out loud in a pub. Instead, Tom just started talking without notes, diving deeply into Greek ways of thinking, laying out rhetoric in detail, and bringing us into exchanges and discussions. No notes, just Tom and his brilliant mind leading me to what I sometimes think of as an arc of rhetoric, from the personal to the communal and then the societal. That first night in the pub, we stayed very late, interrupting Tom with questions about rhetorical theory and practice, argument and design, narrative and logic, Greeks and Romans. And we only left late at night when the streets of Berkeley finally went quiet. We met in that pub for the rest of the semester with an intense and intimate engagement that led to many years of rhetoric at Berkeley. That classical beginning led to studies in medieval and later Renaissance rhetoric, to later centuries on up until the present, with fellowships in London and Oxford, and then to my own career teaching rhetoric at Berkeley and then later Los Angeles. The second question is about the round tables and the starting point for thinking about the foundation. We're an experiment in curiosity among rhetoricians. Our international society simply means that we're all reading quintillion among ourselves in different languages, discussing. Another curiosity arose when we were well advanced in the scheduling. We had scheduled 27 colleagues from 27 institutions, pretty much covering the whole globe. Was there anything to be gained by talking together? Was it be the only time to meet? Did it matter that we might have different interests or approaches to what we called and thought about rhetoric? As rhetoricians ourselves, why did it matter who read Quintilian? In what circumstances? And for what reasons? And more broadly, what did it mean for rhetoric to have a history? And if it had a history, was it universal? Or did it simply adjust to time and place? Driving all this was simple curiosity. What did our colleagues with shared interests, but with different national traditions, what did they think they were doing? And could they present their questions to other colleagues who were confronting their own questions? I really did not know. And as it proved, neither did anyone else. The nearest comparison for what I had in mind was young school children playing show and tell. Just tell us briefly, what are you and your friends doing? What are you talking about? We can all worry later about connections and implications. And to be sure, Greek and Roman rhetoric can be discussed anywhere. But what are you folks up to? And what, if anything, do you want to tell us? It was raw curiosity and thus attractive. The panels were organized in the most open-ended manner possible, that of the context of neighboring geographies. 1, research in Western and Northern Europe. 2, research in Eastern Europe and Asia. 3, research in the Americas, North and South. It was curiosity that animated our colleagues, and several panelists wrote me later to say that participation in these open-ended discussions had helped them with their own projects. Some said that no one had ever asked them questions that had an international scope, or conversely, that they hadn't thought about their own project in a broader fashion, or they hadn't made the connection between their own project and that of even a nearby colleague. And some colleagues simply wanted to know where to find the closest tavern, since that was where the best discussions always took place. Cecilia's second question was, what was your impression of rhetoric studies in Brazil? Or did I jump ahead there? Or did I jump ahead? You see the possibilities for interaction between ISHR and other societies, like that in Brazil. I had brought the wrong languages to the conference, but colleagues went out of their way to make sure I was part of their conversations. And I enjoyed the range of sessions and topics. What I particularly enjoyed was that students wanted to talk about their interests and their research, while engagement with colleagues was always exciting. Some discussions focused on regional aspects and issues completely new to me. And this is precisely why we need such engagement. They are the basis of our international gatherings. And the hillsides around the university stay with me still. The visits to fascinating sites, towns, and the intellectual exchanges that happened in relaxed surroundings, and the friendships that formed. I was always the one who benefited the most. Thank you. Your show.
Thank you very much, Larry. And it was very moving to see how you start in this mix of beer, violence, and theater in the time you start studying rhetoric. But thank you for all the comments and impressions. And now I give the floor to Professor Manfred Kraus. Please, Manfred.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for putting this together and bringing a few friends from ISHR together after a long time. Well, your first question was, why and when did I begin studying rhetoric? Actually, I started my academic career as a classical scholar, and with a predominant focus first on early Greek and Platonic philosophy, not on rhetoric. And my PhD thesis, finished in 1984, was on the pre-Socratics, and I'm still doing work on pre-Socratic philosophy. But then, around 1990, I was hired as an author of articles by the Tübingen Wörterbuch of the History of Rhetoric. And this aroused my interest in rhetoric, first in ancient rhetoric only, but then, since these articles were expected to cover the whole span from antiquity to present day, it turned me into a kind of all-rounder in rhetoric. So I did medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modern rhetoric as well. And my first thematic focus in rhetoric was still a classical one on the Greek progymnasmata and the Renaissance Latin translation. So there's also already a combination between antiquity and Renaissance times. And when I relocated from Munich, where I had done my studies, to Tübingen in 1998, this put me into close contact with the Tübingen Rhetoric Department, which is the only rhetoric department that exists in Germany. Oh. And then a bit later in 2000, Frans van Emeren from Amsterdam also dragged me into the argumentation studies community. And I'm still working with them as well. And my focus within argumentation studies, also related to rhetoric, is the theory of the enthymeme. So that would be my answer to your first question. And your second one, what was my experience as a president of ISHR? Well, first thing I'd like to mention is that it deeply intensified my international contacts. I got invitations, and it took me to remote countries such as Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, Mexico, and Brazil. So there were also new challenges that came up and new fields to be discovered. One of them was Jesuit rhetoric. During my conference in Tübingen in 2015, there was a first meeting of scholars interested in Jesuit rhetoric, organized by the late Jerry Murphy, whom we all regret. And this was the first step into Jesuit rhetoric for me. It started during my presidency. But my presidency also brought me into close friendship with other leading ISHR members and past presidents, beginning with Jerry. And I would say the most important points of my presidency term, which was actually 2013 to 15, not 15 to 16, was the building up of a professional membership management and the hiring of the professional services of Kathy Caesar, which we still have the pleasure of enjoying. And also, I renegotiated then a new contract for the journal Rhetorica, still with Berkeley then, or with University of California Press. But unfortunately, this what I negotiated has ended a few years ago. And I was also really overwhelmed by the international response we got to the 2015 Tübingen conference. We had over 400 submissions from all 5 continents, and it was probably arguably the biggest ever ISHR conference in the smallest ever venue. But there's also a kind of drawback, because I organized a roundtable on the future developments of ISHR at Tübingen with some young scholars from all over the world. But unfortunately, this roundtable did not have the impact that I had expected or hoped. Nothing really came from that later on. That was kind of a disappointment. But the 2015 conference, I might mention, was also the first conference of ISHR that had a Brazilian, namely Cecília Coelho, on its program committee, and another one, Marcos Martinho dos Santos, on council. So there were 2 Brazilians involved in the organization of that 2015 conference. And now a third question: what was my impression of rhetoric studies in Brazil? Well, having attended a few rhetoric conferences in Brazil already, I find a large and thriving community there, rhetorical community there, with great interest and good expertise also in the historical dimension. Promising prospects of cooperations with SBR and the Organización Iberoamericana de Retórica do exist. So these are the 2 societies that we have closest contact with, I would say. At least that's true for me. And Brazil being at the moment our largest, our largest membership group in Latin America. But by contrast, the formerly very active and lively contacts with Mexico have dwindled in the last years to practically nil. There is actually at the moment little interest in the history of rhetoric, as it seems, in Mexico. When I was there in 2014, I think it was, together with Larry, or was it 2013, we actually witnessed a session of the Mexican ISHR branch, where they decided officially to break off from us and join some Latin American societies that were more interested in actual present-day rhetoric than in the history of rhetoric. That was a sad thing to witness, actually. We have still a few scattered members in Argentina, but not very many. So in Latin America, rhetoric associations focus more, I think, or that's my impression, on rhetoric as communication theory, on current political debates, populism, post-colonialism, and the like, and much less on history. They're more, I think, a reservoir for RSA-style rhetoricians, I would call them, than for ISHR. But hopefully this can still change with the next conference being called to Mexico. So that was more or less what I have to say. Thank you very so much.
Thank you, Manfred, and apologize for my mistake regarding the dates.
No problem.
You mentioned a point that is really interesting that you can even discuss perhaps later about, because Spanish is one of the 7 languages of the Society for Rhetoric, right, and Portuguese no. And it's curious that the number of Brazilians is always bigger than from the whole other countries in Latin America. Anyway, but now
we still have Spain.
Well, now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Hanne Roer. Please, Hanne, thanks.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thanking for giving me this opportunity to communicate my experience with rhetoric and ISHR. So my way into rhetoric studies was quite accidentally. I studied Greek and Latin and comparative literature, and it was originally my plan to graduate in classical philology, but I missed literary theory, modern linguistic theory, and so on. So that's why I majored in comparative literature. But I wrote my master thesis on Petrarch, and there, of course, I touched upon rhetorical theory and how it was adapted by Petrarch. And I wrote my PhD thesis on Dante Alighieri, his Latin treatises and his theory of poetics and rhetoric. And that's why I think I was encouraged to apply for a position at the university where I was working at the time, University of Aarhus, the second largest town in Denmark. And it was my task to develop new courses in rhetoric for students, all students from the humanities who could elect these courses. And I did that for 6 years, and and eventually I had colleagues as well, and we established a master and a BA and a master BA program in rhetoric and a master for professionals. It was hard work, but I was really happy about teaching rhetoric. I found it really satisfying to offer this program for the students. I knew that they really enjoyed this mix of theory and criticism and practice as well, because we had, of course, courses on oral and written rhetoric, as well as theory and history and the history of rhetoric. That was sort of my quite accidentally I came into rhetoric, but I've been very happy about it since. Apart from teaching, it has allowed me to do research in several areas. I have this. I'm a generalist. I can't sort of make up my mind to specialize in one specific area, and I think that goes for many rhetoricians as well. So, but my main focus of research has been medieval rhetoric, Dante, medieval reception of classical rhetoric, and of course also Jesuit rhetoric. I've been working with the Christian rhetoric, Augustine's rhetoric, and how it was discussed and revised and changed by Jesuit rhetoricians. So that's been my work, the focus of my research for many years. I would say I have also worked with modern rhetoric theory, argumentation theory. I translated Perlman, L'Empire Rhétorique into Danish very soon, because the students really needed that. And I've been working a lot with rhetorical criticism as well, and co-edited a textbook on rhetorical criticism that has come out in four editions throughout the years. So I think that's what I'm going to say about your first question, Cecilia. Mm-hmm. And then I'll change to the second question. I was president of ISHR from 24 to 25. That was only 1 year, which is unusual. But that was because of COVID. We had to postpone the conference in Nijmegen, so I had to sort of accept to just have 1 year, so to get our conference back to odd years. So that 1 year I had was really concentrated on arranging the conference in Copenhagen, and organizing the conference. And it was of course very time consuming, but it was deeply satisfying as well. A very good experience to work together with colleagues from ISHR. I find the working environment very inspiring, and where people are very helpful, and I had very good collaboration with council members, the Secretary General, the chair of the program committee, and of course also Kathy Caesar that Manfred mentioned. So I think it's characteristic of ISHR that we help each other, and also the conference. They're good. They're inspiring, and there's a good atmosphere where people support each other and give each other positive feedback. So what I also appreciate about ISHR is that it is a truly international conference with participants from well, not all continents, but many continents at least, and not many academic societies in the humanities are that international. So I really enjoyed that. I will say that, of course, that has changed. My first conference was in 2005 in LA. So no, what I mean, what has changed is that there used to be papers in all the 7 official languages of the organization, but recently I think most presentations are in English. And that happens everywhere. I'm also part of a Scandinavian Nordic Association of Rhetoric. We just had a conference last week in Norway, in Oslo, and we used to talk our Scandinavian language, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, because we do understand each other, but now we speak English. So I think that's the benefit of that, of course, is that we have a lingua franca, so we can actually meet people from many different countries. But the backside, of course, is that it's getting difficult for non-speaking scholars to present in their own languages. So that's, I think that's my experience with that. Yeah, but yeah. Cecilia, I'll go on with your third question. I've been to Brazil twice. I participated in the SBR conference in Belo Horizonte in 2018, and the one in Florianopolis in 2023. And I would love to come every year, but unfortunately, I cannot do so because my university has a very strict climate policy. But anyway, I'll try to come as much as possible. But I would say that most papers, I think, were in Brazilian, and though I do not speak Brazilian, of course I do understand parts of it. But of course, if more papers were in English, you would attract more people from the outside. But that's something I think that's something you have to make a decision on. Or maybe it'll just happen, I don't know. My experience with the Nordic Association is that we have gradually slipped into English. And there are pros and cons. But anyway, my impression from the presentations I've heard at the conferences from professors and doctoral students, even students, is that there is a very broad knowledge of classical rhetoric as well as modern rhetoric, and in general continental philosophy, literary theory, French theory, as we sometimes say. I think that my impression is that the students are really very well read in theoretical stuff, and that they know the French sources, whereas our students, they only know it through English translations or through American rhetorical criticism. So I think that I was impressed by the high academic level and the theoretical level impressed me a lot. I think you're very well grounded in structuralism and semiotics. And I think that's important for rhetorical theory. So yes, I think that was about what I would like to say so far. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanne. And whenever you want to come, you are most welcome. We have the conference is at each 2 years, not.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
But we have between the conference, we start the School of Rhetoric. So you have the first School of Rhetoric last year, and you hope to have another one in 2027. Let's see. But thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Robin Reames. Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this and for having me, Cecilia. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the sound okay? Okay, good. I see nods. I'll just start with the third question since that's where we left off and I'm the last speaker. Because I don't have too many specific impressions about the study of rhetoric or the history of rhetoric in Brazil, aside from knowing you through ISHR, Cecilia. I have impressions about what Hanne was just describing about the kind of vibrant, famously vibrant intellectual philosophical life of Brazil. And I remember seeing these like famous pictures of, I think it was Jacques Derrida giving a lecture in the 70s and students just like spilling out into the aisles. And so when I have my first trip to Brazil in August this summer, I expect nothing less. And then that I'll be disappointed if I don't get the reception that Jacques Derrida got. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I have those impressions, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they translate into the same kind of vibrant study of the history of rhetoric. Regarding your first question, when I started studying rhetoric, I feel like every time I answer that question, the answer is a little bit different. They're all true. They're just different versions of what I guess I'm thinking of at the moment. And in a sense, I started studying rhetoric in the cradle. I was born in the deep South, the American South, in a kind of fire and brimstone religious sort of family. And so I think my first encounters with like high oratory from the pulpit were like very informative for me and impressive. And I think really my career in rhetoric started by trying to kind of make a kind of intellectual sense of the power of language that I encountered from a very early age. My studies early on involved the study of Greek and Latin, not because I went to an especially good school, but because it was considered required for being able to read the scriptures well. And so I bounced around a lot in my formal training. I never finished high school. I got admitted to college anyway. It was kind of an unusual story in some ways. It's not the typical academic path that people tend to follow. But I guess the way that I came to rhetoric as a formal study is that as an undergraduate, I developed it. I was studying literature, but I was really interested in the philosophy of language. And in an American context, an Anglo-analytic American context, the study of the philosophy of language it's very focused on like sense and reference in the Anglo-American tradition. I was very interested in language and interested in theories of language, but that tradition wasn't really answering the kinds of questions that I had. And I didn't really have a vocabulary for the kinds of questions that I did have, but they had something to do with the way I would have put it then. They would have had something to do with like a way of being able to wrangle with and comprehend those early experiences with language that I had. And for somebody to be able to give me a sort of theoretical taxonomy for what I had witnessed and experienced. The way I would put it now is that I think I was looking for a disciplinary apparatus that didn't separate language and metaphysics as two different fields of study. And I was lucky enough to have a few mentors who knew enough about rhetoric, which, I mean, there was not a single rhetoric class on offer in the university that I went to. It just didn't exist. I mean, it continues to be a marginalized discipline globally, at least for the last century or so. But I had some mentors who knew enough about enough different things to point me in the direction of reading a little bit about rhetoric. And once I realized that there was an entire discipline that was historically grounded, that had its own canonicity, it had its own canon of texts, that had over the course of many centuries, millennia, in fact, been trying to answer exactly the kinds of questions that I had about language. How does it evoke its power? How are language and metaphysics related? Well, then I felt like, I'm home. I found it. This is it. And so for me, the turning point was actually just reading some of Martin Heidegger's later language theory, and then kind of working my way back through Martin Heidegger. And when I kind of landed on this explanation that, Aristotle's rhetoric is the first systematic study, or the first systematic hermeneutics of humans' everydayness with one another, and their everydayness of being with one another and being with one another in language and speaking with one another. I was like, this is it. This is exactly it. And so it was through Heidegger that I found the ancients. Heidegger was who led me to the Greeks. Heidegger was who led me to the pre-Socratics. And so to this day, my interest really as a scholarly interest is the way that the pre-Socratics and the sophists together were theorizing a kind of commingling of world and word, of metaphysics and language, and those early theories of rhetoric. And I mean, that's just bottomlessly fascinating to me. It's been fascinating to me since I first sort of figured out that this was where my interests were. And since rhetoric gave me a vocabulary, a really rich and sophisticated vocabulary for the interests that I didn't quite know that I had. I mean, I knew that I had, but I didn't have the language for them. And it's really been a process for me of being able to articulate that the value of those ideas, the historic value of those ideas for understanding politics and being with one another today. And so rhetoric is to me, the only discipline that affords us that opportunity to have this rich corpus of texts, a very rich history that's asking some of the most fascinating and also understudied and neglected questions, but then it can always sort of shed new light and offer new insight into the problems and the politics of language, and issues and problems of communication that arise today and that still continue to beset us. So that's me. In my most recent book, I'm trying to kind of translate some of that knowledge for a general audience. I wrote a book that was really meant to take some of these big questions in rhetoric and make them more legible, more comprehensible to a general audience, because they're fascinating, because they're helpful, because they're illuminating, and they're just not, there isn't really a resource for that in the popular culture in the way that there is for, say, psychology has its pop psychology, philosophy has its pop philosophy. And so it's a way for a general audience to distill and understand the questions that drive those of us who study rhetoric. So that's been kind of one interest of mine. But the other kind of more scholarly project that I'm still sort of chipping away at and have been for a few years now is a study of Protagoras. I'm really, and when I was writing my book on Plato, Protagoras sort of nudged Socrates and Plato out of the spotlight for me. The Protagoras really became kind of this really fascinating figure to me, especially as I started meditating on the various points of connection I was seeing between Protagoras and pre-Socratic thought. Again, where the relationship between language and metaphysics exists. So that's the interest I'm working on right now. Challenges organizing the first International Society of the History of Rhetoric in Latin America. The challenges have been enormous. I'm not going to lie. They've been enormous. It's been, I think it's challenging to plan a conference, full stop, under the best of circumstances. Doing it remotely adds a layer of challenges. Really, that's only been a challenge of the inconvenience of not being able to be in the place where I'm trying to plan the conference. But it was important to me that we do this despite the challenges for numerous reasons. One is just the simple fact that International Society for the History of Rhetoric, one of its mandates and core commitments is that it's supposed to be truly international. And our longstanding tradition of sort of pinging back and forth between Europe and the Americas, it felt to me it was insufficient, that what we meant by the Americas had up to that time really only encompassed the United States and Canada. And with Spanish being the largest language group in the Americas by a huge margin, and there are over 400, almost 420 million Spanish speakers in the Americas, it seemed to me that it was the right time for the society to encompass more of that language group and what we mean by the Americas. And then it was also propelled, that decision was also partly propelled by the fact that just before it was time for us to announce the next conference location, when we convened in Copenhagen, we had just learned that there was going to be this new visa fee restriction in the United States, particularly pertaining to people from Latin America. And so it just seemed like the right time. It seemed like, no, you know, this was the year we were going to kind of expand what we mean by the Americas and encompass more of the Spanish-speaking Americas. So I'm super excited about this, despite the challenges. I've taken 2 planning trips so far and walked all over that absolutely enormous and completely gorgeous city of Ciudad de Mexico. I found what I think is going to be an absolutely perfect and beautiful conference site for us. It's a building that's owned by UNAM, but it's right in the center of the city, and it has absolutely everything we could possibly imagine needing. And I think it'll be a really magical place for us to study and convene, and also just to kind of think about ways that, as you mentioned, these collaborations across Portuguese-speaking Portuguese-speaking Americas, Spanish-speaking Americas, English-speaking Americas, and French-speaking Americas, and other language groups as well might be drawn together for the ISHR in 2027. And I'm excited too that it happens to fall on our 50th anniversary. It seems like the right time for us to think about not just what the society has been in the past, but what we would like it to be in the future. And in fact, I don't know if this comes across to everyone who's viewing this, but I've just added the website to the chat here for anyone who wants to submit a proposal. The deadline for proposals is coming up. It's in about 13 days from now. So get those proposals in.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for all your comments. And it's really, before I check the chat, it's really interesting. I start by Robin, this idea of doing in Latin America. And this concept, it's so, for me, so complicated because Latin America, well, it's a concept that is connected to language. And when you think United States, this is a problem also in other societies. But when you think in the population in the United States, they study, for instance, of reception of classical tradition. It's so active in the United States. So if you think in those a research or a book in reception in Latin America or rhetoric in Latin America, actually this concept, it's like a trap, because we have all this group, and it's not a geographical concept. It's a linguistic in some sense, but sometimes it's treated as a geographical concept. So I think it's really time to think about what you mean by Latin America, because you think in general in Central America, Mexico, and South America. But also the difference between tradition in Spanish America and in Portuguese America, it's huge. So sometimes to put everything in the same concept or in the same word category, it's really complicated. So I think it will be a very nice time to discuss about this concept, and even the history of rhetoric in these different countries, in the sense that colonized by Portuguese or Spanish, or in the case by English. And one thing that also I'd like just to point, when Larry and also I think Hanne talk about the conference in Brazil. One thing that Brazilian Society of Rhetoric is different, in spite is connected to the history of rhetoric, but in general, we have 1/3 of speakers that came from discourse analysis, linguistic. We always have this percentage in the meetings of the Brazilian Society for Rhetoric. So for this reason, use the name rhetoric, and many times in the most part of the majority of the conference you organized, we didn't put a subtitle. We just put rhetoric because we are still trying to put together all the people that work with history of rhetoric, also Jesuit rhetoric, but also with some fields related to rhetoric and discourse analysis, as Manfred said. It is very strong in Spanish America, in Argentina, in Chile, the work with political and discourse analysis, etc. And one last thing about Hanne said about the difficulty. We always invite foreign speakers for our conference, for the interaction, etc. And one thing that sometimes we do is to ask the text in English or French or Italian. We have a strong French tradition in Brazil, when you talk about this. The University of São Paulo had strong connection and was one of the most important university that many people from other states in Brazil, they studied there, they went to other states and they start other departments, other work in other fields. But a great part of Brazilians scholars in classics, in philosophy, University of São Paulo was very important and has a strong French connection. But one thing that we try to do, also because of the CAPES Foundation, foundation from the Ministry of Education that gives support to all the programs in our universities in the whole Brazil, is to attend the issue of internationalization. So many times you receive foreigners and they speak in their language and you project the text or sometimes the translation on the screen, so more people can be able to understand, to follow undergraduate students, etc. But in general, we always accept papers, in Portuguese, English, Spanish, French, Italian, etc. So this is a characteristic of our meeting. Well, I don't know if there is any question in the chat. I don't see, it seems there is no question, but I would like just to ask if you would like to make any comment, or Manfred or Hanne or Robin or Larry, about the talks of each one. I really found interesting to see how many different in you four, the difference between how you arrived in rhetoric and the background for this. One thing that, just one more question and I finish. Manfred said about Tübingen. For us in Brazil, in a conference, not of the Brazilian Society for Rhetoric, but the Brazilian Society for Classical Studies, which is a young, but it's older than the Rhetoric of Society. And actually the Rhetoric of Society we started discussing about it during a conference of the Brazilian Society for Classical Studies. But I remember the first conference I went in 1987, I was an undergraduate student, and the conference of the Classical Society, there was a performance by a text by Walter Jens, a dialogue, Sophocles and Brecht. And in the performance of this dialogue, the name of Walter Jens came. He's a professor from Tübingen in the Cathedra of Rhetoric. For me, it was very interesting to see that. And later, we even made a new performance of this play during the Conference of Rhetoric in Florianopolis. And Manfred could give me some information about this it's almost a hapax in German, to have a Cathedra of Rhetoric at the University of Tübingen. This was really interesting. Anyway. But I don't know if there are any comments, or if you like to.
One brief comment, if I may. One of the most striking things about our society from the very first time I had any encounter with it right up until this present moment is that I had the wonderful experience of going out to dinner with my footnotes. I was dining with them. I sat down and had dinner and breakfast with my library. I don't know of other societies where that happens.
That's right.
Same to me.
I fully agree. This is where I found my best friends ever, really.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. And we think so much about those wonderful people whom we have lost in the last several years. These were giants.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any comments? Or I think if you don't have, there's no comments on the chat, but if not, then you are on time. But it's 1 hour of conversation. It was really, I think, very interesting and important for our community, but also for our people. I saw in the chat there, Violeta Perez is here, Tiziano, the president of the Brazilian Society of Rhetoric. But this talk, this roundtable, will be available on the YouTube of the Brazilian Society of Rhetoric, so other people who were not able to come or want in the future to see a bit of our history can listen to the talk.
Thank you, Cecilia. This has been magnificent.
There is something in the chat. Someone, creo que Nunes, wrote, alguien en español o que subtitule. He's asking that you have subtitles in Spanish to this meeting, because he said we are more than 600 millions of hablantes de este idioma. This is interesting to see the necessity of communication in the sense. But a good thing that you are also able to have now is even the automatic translation can be helpful for this. But thank you for Nunes for your comments. Okay, so as you don't have more questions, I would like to thank you all again very much, Larry, Manfred, Hanne, and Robin, for taking your time to be here with us, for giving your information about your experience, your background. And I do hope you can meet in presence other times in Brazil or other place. And thank you very much. So And thank you, Marcus, also for helping with the assistance. Marcus. Okay. So,
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, same from
Thank
here.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
See you in
Looking
Mexico.
forward to getting together
Yes, we
with
will see
you
in Mexico.
on more than screen.
And don't forget to submit something to the next conference.
yes, but we still have 13 days.
That's right.
So goodbye and thank you again.
Okay, bye-bye, and thank you for this event.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.